Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't been able to peek down at the chat, we always like to encourage folks to introduce themselves and let us know where they're joining us from, organization, as well as your role at your organization. My name is Megan Simmons. I'm a senior policy attorney with UGMA Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. We really appreciate you joining us today for our To Serve and to Protect Black Women. It's expanding our understanding of safety as the status quo shifts. This is the second part to a two-part series presentation. Please know that we are recording these presentations in the event that you want to review back, or if you want to share them with others in your network and community. You can also find, you will automatically get it emailed to you. If for some reason you don't, feel free to check our YouTube, or you can reach out to one of us directly. We will make sure that we leave our email addresses in the chat box. Just a few housekeeping things. There will be the opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you can drop those in our questions or Q&A box, it just makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of identify the questions instead of just in the chat. Feel free to drop information, articles that may be relevant to the conversation. We always are exploring new content, and we love for people to have the opportunity to share, as well as, you know, while we are in this virtual presentation, we like for people to have some sort of opportunity to network with each other, since we're not all physically with each other, so that perhaps at some point you'll have the opportunity to work together. Like I said, my name is Megan Simmons. Just to share a little bit more about UGMA, we are a culturally specific organization, and we're based out of Washington, D.C. We specifically advocate for Black women and girls as it relates to community violence, domestic violence, as well as sexual assault. My role is specifically related to policy that usually falls in a few different buckets, to include Black maternal health, economic abuse, and I do a good bit with housing at this point, as well as Title IX. I'm going to go ahead and just roll right into our presentation, just to kind of give you a summary for those who weren't here for the first part. And again, it was recorded in the event that you would like to review it. The first part of the webinar grounded us in the language of police reform. Panelists articulated the difference between various police reform ideologies, which means defund, abolish, reform, and dismantle, and the potential outcomes for Black survivors. Panelists also set the stage for part two, also by delving into the potential impacts that police reform could have for not only the survivor community, but for communities at large. The second part of the webinar presentations brings together a small group of community-based and domestic violence service providers for a round-robin style conversation on the role that Black leadership will play in supporting survivors' safety as policies shift and change. So that just kind of gives you some grounding as to what we're going to be talking about and what we previously discussed. Just to share with you what our objectives are. It's to learn the community engagement strategies and best practices when working with survivors within the Black community. We hope to delve into concepts of health and justice as they relate to Black women's experiences with violence. And we'd also like to discuss the role and needs of Black women leadership as domestic violence field adopts more of a social and racial justice lens. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. We have some great folks that are very experienced. First, Ms. Allison Messenger, who's the managing staff attorney at Genesee, based out in California. Allison is the managing staff attorney of Genesee Inc., award-winning legal services department. She leads Genesee's in-house legal services program, domestic violence clinic at the Inglewood Courthouse, and Genesee's domestic abuse response team, or DART, programs at LAPD's 77 Southeast and Southwest Division. Allison is also responsible for implementing and administering Genesee's pro bono initiatives, including free housing, immigration, family law, and restorative justice clinics. Thanks for being with us, Allison. Next, I'll be introducing Dr. Sharman Davis, Director of the Family Wellness Center, which is also a part of Genesee. With over 25 years of unyielding commitment to serving families in Southern California, Dr. Davis continues to make her mark as an accomplished community leader. Is currently training in South Central Training Consortium, servicing unattended to mental health and clinical counseling needs of diverse populations around LA. She received her master's in marriage and family therapy from Pacific Oaks College with a specialization in African American family studies. Welcome, Dr. Davis.
Thank you.
And next, Ms. Monica Edwards, who's a federal policy manager at URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity. Monica is a queer intersectional Black feminist and currently works as the federal policy manager at URGE. In her role, Monica does federal policy work and coalition building to advocate for reproductive justice in young people. As a proud Southerner, Monica was born and raised in Alabama and is an alumni of the University of Alabama and the University of Alabama School of Law. Monica is a longtime outspoken activist, having done organizing and programming work in college. She continued organizing and activism in law school and was part of her law school's Black Law Student Association, or BALSA, Outlaw Queer Straight Alliance, and La Raza. A lover of reproductive justice, her passions include activism and writing around issues of intimate partner violence, racial justice, abortion access, and combating anti-Blackness. Welcome, Monica. Good to see you.
Good to see you all.
And Ms. Lucane LaFortune, Deputy Director of Programs at Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. Lucane is a Haitian American intersectional feminist, currently pursuing a PhD in education and transformational leadership. Her work is concerned with survivors on the margins. Lucane has served as a victim service expert for more than 20 years. She's the co-founder of Culture Works, a social justice firm that aims to enhance the way organizations, government agencies, and business engage culturally diverse communities. Welcome, Lucane. And just to let you know, you're on mute, so I don't know if you meant to say hello or not, but I just wanted to kind of let you know. All right, folks, we are going to roll right into the questions. This is a question for all of the folks on the panel. How are Black women currently experiencing violence at the intersections? In what way do Black women experience barriers when working with systems generally? Law enforcement, as well as the criminal legal system. Folks, we're going to drop these questions in the chat just to let you know, for the panelists, as well as for the folks that have joined us, just so people can kind of stay abreast, because I know it, it gets a little, sometimes you forget some of the details of the question. So we just want to make sure people have what they need. And any one of you can jump in.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in very, very quickly. Also, apologies, y'all, if I look a little weird. True to being in COVID or panoramic life, my computer is being weird. And so like my Zoom is not loading. So I'm on a Zoom from my phone. So if I look a little weird, that's why. And if at any point you can't hear me, just let me know. I just like to say, like, we Black women have been and always are currently and always have been experiencing violence at the intersections. Since 1619, when Black folks were first brought to these shores, Black folks and Black women have experienced injustice at every level in the United States. And that goes from enslavement to rape, enforced childbearing, experimentation, denial of the right to parent, forced sterilization, or more recently, like restrictions on abortion access and state-sanctioned violence. And that, when I say state-sanctioned, I mean both policing and law enforcement, as well as immigration officials. So from the beginning of America's founding, and I do that in air quotes, Black women have sat at the intersections of race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender expression, and more. And because of this, we experience violence at every level in a unique way that most folks don't. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing that. I think
Yes.
this is Lucane here. And I'm going to speak from my positionality right now because I am a Haitian immigrant. And I think oftentimes when we talk about violence at the intersections, we tend to forget about immigrants, specifically Black immigrants. And as we continue to see that borders are really constructs and that the real people in charge are, Mother Nature, and that, as we continue to see inequity grow, that it is in fact those women, Black women, Black immigrants, such as Haitians, Cubans, as you've all seen recently in Del Rio, and these women have been actually migrating for many, many, many years. Interestingly, one of the things that I did since it's been in the news, well, since I've learned about it from family members and also when it got the news, is I looked to see what agencies were doing to address this, right? What agencies in our movement are doing to talk about these intersections. And I did not see anything, especially from Del Rio in Texas. So that's one of the things that I wanted to point out. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica and Lucane, for lifting up those really important facts about our experience as Black women at the intersections and our experience with violence. And I'm going to speak from my perspective, working with survivors of intimate partner violence in the communities of South Los Angeles. And I'll say, I think we're at a really interesting crossroads at this period of time. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we have an unprecedented opportunity to really lift up and push through much needed reforms around social justice, racial equity, police reform, criminal justice reform. But also at the same time, with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that too has shown a spotlight on the issue of domestic violence. Many people said that DV was already an epidemic in our country and that it just got worse with the pandemic. And so we see these issues of social justice and racial justice and racial equity and reform intersecting with the issues of domestic violence, but I don't really see us talking about that intersection. And we're especially not really talking about it as it pertains to Black women who are experiencing intimate partner violence. What does it mean to reform our system of law enforcement and our systems of criminal justice? And how does that affect Black women who are experiencing violence in their homes? And I really think that as we move to make these really important policy changes, that we are also centering the voices and the experiences of Black women as it pertains to intimate partner violence. It's really interesting because I read a study out of Chicago, which talked about there being a decrease in reporting to the police regarding domestic violence in the wake of the pandemic. And then when they drilled down further, they saw that that decrease really was in communities of color, the Black community specifically. We were not calling the police at rates that we had pre-pandemic. Not that we really saw that as a viable solution before the pandemic, but even, but in the wake of the pandemic, our reporting to police has lessened. And so I think we need to peel back the layers and ask, what does that due to? How much of that is due to the pandemic itself? How much of that may be due to around the messaging of the racial and social justice movements we're experiencing right now? And what impact does that have on Black women's health and safety? And so those are kind of issues that we're focused on right now as advocates working in the trenches with survivors.
And I guess if I can just piggyback off of what Allison said, and thank you, so well said. Some of those barriers are barriers for folks to be able to heal and move on with their lives, right? Like, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing through the computer. And being able to move on with their lives and just this whole system. So barriers are built within the system of Black women being able to trust the people that they're calling for help, that they feel comfortable enough that they know that if they ask for help is coming. In our communities around the country, in Black communities, the reality is we don't trust. A lot of that, I guess we'll talk about the distrust in the Black community for some, police organizations. And I think those barriers are being able to initially call for help, be put in a space of healing, and keep your families together and intact. And I think huge barriers lie in this whole systemic racism that we see in terms of being able to keep families together and for us to feel safe.
Thanks so much. Folks, just to let you know, I dropped a little note in the chat box, but if you are developing questions while all this wonderful insight is being shared, please go ahead. You don't have to wait until the end. You can drop them in our Q&A box now so that we can be ready to respond, at the end of the questions that we have for our panelists. This question is for the folks at Genesee. What are Black survivors saying about police reform, Black police response generally, or even the aftermath of George Floyd's murder? Where do Black survivors see themselves in all of this? Sounds like you've answered some of that already, actually. Either one of you can go first.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I'll say for our clients, turning to the police was always a questionable option, and one that was fraught with a lot of uncertainty and fear. We know historically that law enforcement has inflicted great devastation on our communities. And so while calling the police might seem like a normal reaction to some, for Black women experiencing domestic violence, that was an option that was fraught with a lot of, again, uncertainty and fear. Fear that if the police respond, that their partner might become a victim of police brutality or state-sanctioned murder. Fear that they won't be believed, or that worse, they'll be treated as the aggressor versus the victim, and mistakenly and wrongfully arrested and prosecuted as the aggressor within the situation. And then I also have to lift up the fear around reporting to Child Protective Services. For a lot of our clients, that's a huge concern, because they know that if the police are called and it's revealed that a child was present in the home, even if they were not a direct victim of the violence, that Child Protective Services will be called and an investigation launched, and that they are then in danger of losing custody of their children. So these were already concerns within our clients, for our clients within the communities that we serve. And I would say in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, with police reform, I think the concern again is, will turning to systems that are supposed to be there to protect and serve even be an option? Is that even an option that it is considered appropriate for Black women to turn to? A lot of our clients feel that when they call the police, that they are betraying the community, because you are now bringing into your family a system that has done such great violence and destruction to our communities. And so I think that they're concerned that with some of the current reforms occurring, at least in the county of Los Angeles, that turning to law enforcement for help may not even be seen as a viable or an appropriate option.
And we are seeing the same clients, Allison, and so everything she said, and we have this community of Black women who they see the criminalization of abuse and not the abuser, right? They are afraid of the outcome that can happen, because again, police are not always equipped and trained to understand and know what trauma looks like. So they may arrest both of them, or they may arrest the victim. And also, these women, they are afraid that of the unfavorable, again, experiences that happen with Black males with the police, and they're afraid. So they're really deciphering between whether they should call the police, because they not only have their partners that they are concerned that could end up injured or killed, but they have Black sons in those homes when the police come out. So these fears are very, very real that they have. Do I call and risk all of us or some of us being injured or killed? Will I lose my children, or do I just stay in this? And sometimes they do. I know, I think it was about 800 and 800 something thousand folks between, I think it was 2018-19 that had domestic violence in their homes. And I think it was something crazy, like only 40% of folks reported it. Just that fear of what comes next when we report, and law enforcement are just not equipped with that trauma-informed care and understanding of how to identify abuse and what that means.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for lifting that up. In Maryland, what we're seeing right now at the Maryland Network, we track homicides every year. And one of the trends we're seeing is, it's nothing new. I mean, we're all familiar with cases like Marissa Alexander and so on. So when they do call, when survivors call the police or they seek out protection order, they in turn become criminalized. We are seeing a trend, especially in some counties, where they are rushing people through the system and giving them up to 10 years for defending themselves against the abuser, even though they've engaged with the system for a very, very long time. And we're also seeing the same pattern of, losing, the risk of losing your children with CPS, and people really are not.
Just a moment. I'm sorry to interrupt, Lucane. Folks in the audience, can you check and see if maybe you're not on mute? We're getting a little feedback here, and I just want to make sure we all can hear all of the thoughts of the panelists. So if you could just kind of check and see if your mute button's on. Thanks so much. Sorry to interrupt, Lucane.
I muted myself just in case I was the one giving the loop, the echoes. No, what I was saying was that we're seeing something similar in terms of CPS being called and not really being helpful, especially in cases when people are extremely poor and they cannot afford, the basics, but also cannot afford legal assistance. And what we're seeing is is that the system is moving people quickly through the process, even though they have tried to engage the system as a way of protecting themselves. When they do end up protecting themselves, they are criminalized. And we've had probably about, I believe, 4 or 5 cases that we've seen thus far. And we've also seen a lot of suicide and murder-suicide as well. Which, a lot of times, as people do reach out, and even, when they reach out, they want the abuse to stop. Even when there's fear that they're going to be hurt by the system, whatever they do, if they take it in their own hands, they're going to be criminalized. And we know that, especially for Black women. In Maryland. So I just wanted to share those specific numbers, in terms of what's happening here.
Thanks so much. Monica, we're going to transition into legislation. Why is legislation like VAWA critical to Black women's safety and survival? Please share the ways you think unintended consequences of VAWA can be avoided.
Sure. And I am certainly not a VAWA expert, so I encourage my fellow panelists to chime in.
Sure.
But so in 1994, the original VAWA, or Violence Against Women's Act, was created, and was really the first U.S. legislation that in the U.S. that really began to even recognize or acknowledge sexual assault and domestic and intimate partner violence as a crime. And obviously that is critical and important for all survivors, but especially Black women. And when I say Black women, I'm also including Black trans women, because we know that before any issue can be combated or solved, it has to first be recognized and acknowledged as a problem. So that, of course, is critical, and that makes VAWA a really critical piece of legislation, just for I think the culture shift work that it has done over time. And then with that, over time, so VAWA gets renewed, and over time it's gotten renewed, and we've seen it improved upon. Like, so for example, it has added provisions that include stalking, that increases funding for community-based services, supporting survivors legally, like LaCain just talked about, and for those who don't want to report and take legal action in some way, shape, or form. And most recently, it began to acknowledge the disproportionate impact and resources needed for LGBTQIA plus folks and Indigenous survivors. So it has been improved upon, I think, over time. And for that reason, for that and the critical culture shift work it has done has been really critical for survivors, especially Black women. However, one of the unintended consequences, or what even some survivors will argue was actually intended, was increased funding for law enforcement, including hiring and training new and or existing law enforcement to respond to domestic violence. And as LaCain said, like with that, we have seen even the criminalization of survivors experiencing domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or sexual assault. And with that criminalization, we've seen increased incarceration of women who have been a victim of sexual or domestic violence. And I think many of these consequences can be avoided by trauma-informed policing. I think by redirecting funding from law enforcement and putting it into communities and organizations that are able to best support survivors. And in terms of legislation, I know there have been many conversations about ways to improve upon VAWA as it currently is. Some folks think we need a whole new VAWA, more modern version. And like, I think that's an ongoing conversation between folks in the movement and survivors. And while myself don't have the answer, basically is what I'm saying, I don't have the answer. I think in order to get to a solution, those most impacted have to be centered and they have to be at the table. And I think that's where we have to start.
Allison, what are your thoughts?
I echo everything that Monica just shared, but I also wanted to lift up that one of the unintended or intended consequences of VAWA is that some of the forms of immigration relief, for example, specifically require that immigrants interact with and be helpful to law enforcement. And so we've already talked about how problematic it can be for victims of color, survivors of color experiencing IPV to interact with law enforcement. And those same concerns apply to immigrant communities, particularly, Black immigrant communities who kind of have this double whammy of being Black and also an undocumented immigrant in this country, where our immigration laws are so xenophobic and in many ways racist. And so to require immigrants to have to report to law enforcement that they are a victim of a crime, and then go further and be helpful, however law enforcement defines that helpfulness to be, I think is a consequence that requires immigrants to interface with a system that has not always been and continues to not be sensitive to and responsive to the needs of Black or immigrant communities. And so I think that that's one change we need to look at in terms of, when we talk about VAWA and the unintended consequences of this really important piece of legislation that has created so much funding and allowed so many programs to expand, but at the same time, there have been harms that VAWA has created.
You're muted, Megan.
Thank you. Happens to the best of us. Can you talk to us about the way in which anti-Blackness shows up in our work? What, if any, is the relationship with carceral feminism? And anyone can jump in.
I can jump in because I've somewhat prepared for this, and anyone else can add. I wanted to also add that, you know, just calling it violence against women and being a little bit very inclusive in terms of trans folks and being non-binary, I think that's an unintended consequence. And, you know, if you mix that with trans folks who are experiencing, especially Black trans folks who are experiencing gender bias in other countries, you know, giving them access through VAWA, that would be really amazing. As far as anti-Blackness in our movement, I mean, I think the lack of using intersectionality as a lens in general that's anti-Blackness, because we know we do not live single issued lives, as our Audre Lorde, amazing Audre Lorde said. But specifically, again, to speak from my own positionality, I think the way that we, our approach to the work is very paternalistic. And I say, and paternalism in a way that we tell you what to do or else you get in trouble, or this is the right way to be, whether it's in shelter, whether it's in, you know, service provision, sheltering or housing, or any kind of other assistance. For example, I've been thinking about with COVID, people getting assistance for housing, you know, with their landlords and all that stuff. They have so many hoops to jump through that a lot of times the people that are working on the other side, they say they haven't seen any applications. And as someone who's middle class, you know, I basically just called my bank and said, hey, I need an extension, you know? So we make it even harder for people at the intersections to improve their lives. One of the things that I think that's happened since George Floyd, and this sort of has to do with just how everybody sees themselves as, you know, this is the way to be, right? This is kind of like what's the word? Popular way to be. And so there's a lot of virtue signaling in the movement right now, where people, you know, they're kind of, you know, repeating, even quoting amazing Audre Lorde, or showing that they are somewhat woke, you know, on social media or even in staff meetings. Meanwhile, they still treat their counterparts differently. I mean, even in Maryland, the number of program directors that are people of color, you would assume that, because a lot of people assume Maryland is very diverse, and it is, in fact, an extremely diverse state compared to others. Yet we still have a small number of folks who are in power in terms of people of color who are running programs. And even around the country in terms of, you know, women of color, Black women who are running some of the programs around the country, right? And so I see that show up, and I also see a lot of colorism, even when people are hired, when people of color are hired to work in the field, there may not necessarily be, you know, whether it's like dark-skinned folks, or even when they hire people from various cultures, they may not even understand where they are with regards to their privilege. So we could talk about anti-Blackness, you know, that's something we can talk about forever, but I know we don't have forever for this panel. In terms of carceral feminism, I think from where I stand in Maryland, we are, we're kind of far away from there. I think people are still talking about reform, police reform versus abolition. There are a lot of us who are on the side of abolition. We're saying that, no, we don't want that. There are other ways of imagining justice, right? And so I think with carceral feminism, I'm gonna be honest, there are, if you think about the people who are most likely in power in the field, in the movement, those folks, especially white women, are very attached to law enforcement and believe that their work is not going to, cannot be done without law enforcement. And I think we need to have more conversations about what it can look like without policing. What does accountability look like, right? Is it retribution? Is it punishment? So I think we need to have more conversations in our communities. Our communities already know that, right? Because we've done a lot of work. We haven't trusted the system as much. But in terms of the movement itself, it's still very carceral, and people are very much attached to responding with law enforcement. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Anyone else jump in?
Everything LaCaine said, and just want to like something else I throw in. Like I'm over here like yes the whole time. But I'm thinking of too about, and this is not just for the like survivor movement, but this is for the reproductive rights, health and justice movement. This is for the climate change movement. When we think about storytelling and whose stories we center, it overwhelmingly is not that of Black folks. It is overwhelmingly not that of immigrants. It's overwhelmingly not that of queer and trans folks. It's oftentimes cis white women. And because of that, I think we've begun, as LaCaine said, to look at like carceral feminism as like the solution. And we've become very attached to solving the issue with more policing. And I think a lot of that is a result of centering the stories of people who are not the most impacted. Because when you have people at the table who are Black, who are queer and trans, who are young people, who are immigrants, like you get that intersectional lens. But because for so long we haven't had those people not only at the table, but leading the table, we've centered the stories of cis white women. And as a result of that, we are very tied to carceral feminism.
Thanks, Monica. Allison, Sharman, and we can transition if they have said all the things, and they have said a lot of,
They have.
put out a lot of great messaging. Of course, we can transition. I just don't want to cut anyone off.
Yeah, I just echo everything LaCaine and Monica said, and without repeating anything, you know, in terms of the ways that I think anti-Blackness shows up in our work, you know, it started from the founding of the DV or anti-DV movement, you know, which really was an outgrowth of the white-led feminist movement, and our voices were not centered. We were not at the table when, you know, policies were made around service, around sheltering, and I think what that means is that many times Black women are misperceived when we reach out for help to these, you know, systems, these DV intervention organizations. I coined the term, you know, the burning bed syndrome. You know, if a victim doesn't present in a certain way, then she's not believed. And too often, you know, as Black women, you know, we are not perceived as being vulnerable. We're not perceived as needing or deserving of protection. We're perceived as angry, hostile, you know, aggressive, because we have the nerve to be mad about the trauma we have experienced. And many times our trauma is not limited to an intimate relationship. It's trauma that's occurred over a lifetime. And so when we present with systems that are throwing up barriers to being able to get the help that we need, you know, then we're labeled as angry, difficult to work with, and we're denied the services so desperately required to escape abuse. And so these are just some of the ways that, you know, anti-Blackness shows up for us in our work. And, you know, it's because, again, our voices haven't been centered. Our leadership is still not reflective of the populations that are most at risk and most, you know, experiencing intimate partner violence. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop there.
Thanks
Totally
so much.
agree.
I see lots of fun and good information, not fun, but good information going on in the chat. Just want to continue to let you all know that we certainly appreciate you dialoguing with each other as well as us. Should you choose. I'm just so glad that you're all putting out that good information. For those that may have joined a little bit later, in the event that you have like articles and different readings that the panelists or each other should read, please feel free to drop that information in the chat so that folks can be even more knowledgeable about these very important topics that we're discussing. We're going to transition into something that is quite important. I think we're going to talk a little bit about sanctuary harm. Please briefly, if one of you could please briefly, or all of you, share a definition of your perspective of sanctuary harm, why it's necessary to talk about it and unpack sanctuary harm experienced by Black survivors while simultaneously talking about police reform. And just to remind folks, we are dropping those questions in the chat box so that folks can review them whenever the panelists are speaking. Any one of you can jump in.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so sanctuary harm is really just a pivotal space in an abuser's existence, right? So they call for help and they reach out to social services or to the police department and they think, here they come to save me, right? Here they come, we're safe. And they come and they are just as abusive as the folks that they're trying to get away from, right? They think these folks are coming to help them and they experience re-traumatization. They experience not being believed. They experience the opposite of help, the opposite of what they have reached out for. And unfortunately, that's what we see with law enforcement, sometimes with other organizations that they, like Allison was talking about, you come and you don't look a certain way and you're perceived in a different, not being culturally competent when you, especially as Black women, we are perceived as angry or, we're mad. And some folks don't understand how to, they're not trauma informed. They don't understand what trauma is, the very nature of it and what it looks like, that maybe this person may be angry or they may kind of disassociate from you when you're talking. You're thinking they're not understanding you or they're just blowing you off. And these are all signs of trauma. These are all signs of what they have gone through. So it's just about you reaching out for help and you getting the opposite back. And we see it every day in our communities, unfortunately.
Thanks so much. It's very important to lift this particular term up. I have been on panels where there are folks that share that they, worked in shelter and worked at various types of organizations. And when you bring it up to discuss it, they were, completely clueless as to what folks were even discussing. And so, like I said, this one in particular, just as a personal aside, I think is very important for us to share within the community so folks are knowledgeable and so that we don't are not causing harm. Allison, I think you were, oh, okay.
Yeah, Megan, I just wanted to echo your sentiments and just share that when I think of sanctuary harm, what it means to me is that you find yourself in a space that is supposed to be one in which you can heal, in which you can overcome, in which you can move forward, with a life that's free of violence. But in that space, you find yourself experiencing more abuse and more trauma. And I think sometimes that can occur specifically in shelter settings, not intentionally, but just in some of the rules and regulations that we impose on shelter residents in the name of safety, right? Everything from you have to be, back at the shelter by a certain time to you can't come or go without telling us where you're going and when you're expected back, not allowing them to have visitors or friends. Their children can't have play dates, with their school friends, all of these rules that we impose around, again, safety, really, we almost put our, shelter residents back in a position of being in a controlling relationship. They just left a controlling and abusive relationship, and now they've entered another one with the shelter provider, right? And, when I started at Genesee, we had, housing agreements with our clients that were like 6-7 pages long. And I know because I helped write them. But I think as we have evolved in understanding, no, we can do this work in the absence of so many quote guidelines and rules. And I'm so proud that, we have really done the work, taken a hard look at what's needed and what is just, something that we impose because maybe a funder said we needed to, or that was the generally accepted best practice in the field, and what really works for our clients, what centers our clients and their needs and is affirming and supportive versus controlling and repressive. I think, when we're in a space of providing services, we really need to ask ourselves, through what lens are we approaching the work so that we're not doing more harm than good.
King?
Yeah, when I think about sanctuary harm, I actually think back to the sanctuary model, which of course makes me think of Tania Kane, and she has an amazing, she has lots of videos, but she talks about her experience before she joined Tamar's children, or the Tamar's program. And, just how she was treated, whether it was in the shelter program or anywhere where they were supposed to really have open arms. And so I think a lot of us are well-meaning, and we come to the movement wanting to help, right? Because, not to make money, obviously we come because we care about the issue. And yet we are also part of this system in which we want people to prove their worth. We want people to prove why they deserve something. If they're getting, free housing, why should they get free housing? And they can't have free housing if they're doing drugs, right? They don't get to decide what goes in their bodies. You look at everything in general, our approach, I think, even with sheltering, why do we need one big building where we house everybody and we're watching them, right? So there's just so much that we have to think about when we talk about, abolishing or reforming law enforcement in our programs. We also have to think about abolishing, and I don't even want to say reforming, but getting rid of the way that we ourselves oppress the clients or the people that come to our door. And in fact, we sometimes create additional barriers. I'm thinking about working with Black immigrants, for example. We'll say, we don't have any staff who speaks, I don't know, Amharic, for example, right? And the person, there are many ways you can problem solve around that. But a lot of times we say we can't take those clients, and we don't see those, we may not see those clients in the programs because we ourselves are not, are creating the barriers. We're the barriers. So, we'll say, well, if the client can, for example, they can't speak English, that means they can't go to talk to the therapist. Well, okay, well, they don't need therapy. And you talk to the client might say, I don't need therapy, I need a job, right? And so we have to really, really advocate, all of us in this movement have to rethink how we do things. And I believe when I worked at the District Alliance for Safe Housing, I think the voluntary service model was introduced, and I still think it's brilliant, it's amazing. We don't force people to participate in programs because, if they participate, then they, it's like the carrot stick or whatever. And so I think we need to really rethink our models. We need to rethink what people actually need. If it's economic security, economic equity, not more places to be controlled, if you will. So, it's just really interesting. We think about, I think about when I was an advocate, right? If somebody was smoking marijuana back then, back in the days, 20 years ago, they would be out of the shelter. But guess what? We're changing, right? And so, we're not even going to get into that, but there are many people who lost housing because they were, engaging in really, what do you call it? Self-medication. So if you're trauma informed, you understand that, right? So, and then anyway, I can go on and on about it, but I won't. But yeah, it is interesting that we're now have done a 360 from trauma informed model to trauma harm or sanctuary harm. Sorry, sanctuary model to sanctuary harm.
And can I say just really quickly, all this information is so great. And just remember, folks, not just in shelters. So let's say you're in a home or you are able to get low income housing. And, so you have social services in your life and you have this wraparound services in your life for mental health for the children. And they expect these women to feel like, I should feel so blessed and so grateful, but here you're at home, you're supposed to feel safe, but you have the social worker dropping in, you have to go to 50 different classes, you still have to go to work, you have to do these things. And how are you feeling in your own home that you have no control over? You have folks dropping in and wraparound service and all of this, and it's not structured by you. It's structured by folks who put this, gave you this great opportunity to have this apartment or this, home for your children. So we have to be careful with that. All of that is re-traumatization for victims and survivors.
Okay, we're going to transition into our next question, but I did appreciate all of your responses and just wanted to lift up the language barrier that Lucane mentioned, which is so important. I think oftentimes Black people are thought of as a monolith, and we all know that, like other folks, we speak different languages as well. And if your services are located in a certain community, it's probably beneficial to ensure that someone on your staff can speak the language of the individuals that you're going to be serving. Just think that's really important. I think sometimes that gets lost, again, when serving Black survivors. What are some of the hesitancies that are being discussed around police reform from survivors, from advocates, community partners, and other stakeholders? And any one of you can jump in. Not all at once. We can transition to a different question. I
think I started talking about that.
I actually skipped one and I just had started already reading it and just went on, but we can go back or we can go and move forward with this one because the other is relevant to shelter. So if you want to continue in the vein of shelter, that's fine. But if you want to,
I just wanted to add that I think in terms of the language, one thing my mom says all the time is, the way to your mouth. Everybody knows the way to their mouth, whether they're in the dark or wherever they are, they know the way to their mouths. Mm-hmm. And if we think about our approach when we're working with people who speak many languages, is that, even sometimes a gesture, right? You don't need to have money to hire that staff to work there. It's really about shifting our focus. If we're thinking, okay, well, how did we used to communicate with each other when we didn't have all of these different barriers in terms of how we speak and all of that. And by the way, my mother helps me understand, even though she doesn't speak English, but she speaks French and Haitian Creole. Even within that, there are some barriers because of the way that we've made everything written. There's so many things written. There's so many ways for people to get around that it becomes even more of a barrier, especially if you're coming from a country where the resources look different. And so I just wanted to add that in terms of, interacting with folks. You know, I can meet anybody who speaks a different language, but we're gonna communicate. Are you hungry? You know, are you cold? I mean, there are many ways we can communicate without speaking the languages that, you know, making that sound that comes out of your mouth or what have you.
Absolutely. We are going to stick with our topic of shelter. It seems like a hot topic amongst our panelists as well as in our chats. What type of shelter / programs, policies, and practices might lead to unnecessary police interaction? Well, that struck a nerve. You want to go first, Allison?
Yeah, I can remember when I joined Genesee almost 9 years ago, it was still common practice in LA County for shelter providers to require those seeking shelter to have either a police report or a restraining order. And so the requirement that you have to engage with systems that historically have been oppressive and dangerous, frankly, for people of color to interact with before you can, obtain a vital service. In other words, you got to prove that you're really a victim of, domestic violence before we're going to allow you into our program. It's just one of the ways in which, the shelter movement has endangered victims of color. And I can remember Genesee getting pushback because we were one of the first shelter providers to allow survivors, to self-certify, to just say, I'm a victim of, intimate partner violence and I need shelter, period. Without a requirement that, you're going to report the latest incident to the police or that you're willing to get a restraining order. Just, I'm a survivor and I need help. End of story. That was seen as so out of the box and controversial at the time. But now, I'm not aware of any shelter provider, at least in LA County, that still has, those kinds of requirements. But, another way in which I think shelters require particularly survivors of color to interact with dangerous systems is in, their practice of reporting to CPS, families who, they feel that, in most cases, the mom is not protecting the children. Either she's still in communication with the abuser, or they left shelter and the shelter doesn't know where they went. And so they assume that they're going back to the abuser. And so that warrants, a report to CPS. Or some shelters just have a general policy that if children were in the home and exposed to the violence, not as direct victims, but just witnessing it, they're going to report because they're mandated reporters. And once that information is shared, they have a duty to notify CPS, not taking into account that the mere fact of leaving the relationship and seeking shelter are all protective actions, designed to remove the children from potential harm. And so those are just some of the ways in which I think shelter providers force victims to interact with systems that historically are not favorable to families of color and survivors of color.
I definitely wouldn't say anything different than Allison said. She covered everything, and it's those stringent rules, and we're here to help you, but you have to abide by all of these rules, or we have to report, and it's those kind of things that make the interactions and create an unsafe environment. It's just so it's sad how an abused person has to always be afraid. They don't know who they can tell. They're so afraid to just say, this is what I need, because they're afraid if I tell you what I need, then I'm going to get repercussions from that. If I tell you I need somewhere to live, will I be able to keep my children? If I tell you my environment is unsafe, who will you tell, and will my families be able to stay together? So everything Allison said is just right on.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to vary off just a little bit in the vein of the way your question was just answered. It looks like one of the folks in our audience asked, what are your thoughts on requiring participants to file protective orders against their abusers. And it
May
kind of
not necessarily keep them safe just because they file it. There's an assumption that safety is going to come with filing for a protection order, right? And it's really hard. It's become really hard for a lot of people actually to get protection order. And nowadays, I think a lot of people are, some of the abusers are turning it around as part of their gaslighting and using the system to control the survivors. So it's starting to be even harder to get that. But I think first we have to remove the assumption that when you get a protective order, you will be safer. And there are a few studies out there that show sometimes for specific communities that can actually make it less safe for you. So that's my response to that.
Thank you. We have another audience question that I think is pretty important, again, in the vein of this, your responses. It looks like there was one that is, how is it helpful if we do not report parents who willingly expose their children to domestic violence? And anyone can jump in here.
I would just question, what do we mean by we say willingly exposed to domestic violence, right? Because when you think about intimate partner violence and domestic violence, no one is willingly going through domestic and intimate partner violence. People are a victim of domestic and intimate partner violence. As a survivor myself and someone who experienced intimate partner violence not that long ago, I don't consider myself as willingly going through domestic and intimate partner violence. This is a trauma that happened to me. And parents are doing what they can and the best they can in impossible situations. And therefore criminalizing parents in already traumatizing situations is not going to help or solve anything.
And by the time they make it to a shelter, like Genesee, they are asking for help. They are saying, I have removed my family from this, as hard as it was, as much as I had to weigh the odds, as much uncertainty as I have, I've removed them. So what good would it do for us to say, and the reality is, I'm not sure everywhere, I know in California, if you call the police, in terms of a domestic violence situation, if you call the police, a report is automatically generated to the Department of Children and Family Services. So they've already, told that part. So by the time they come to us for help and we're trying to establish trust, put them in a safe environment, there's not a reason for us to report this again.
Gotcha. There's a second part to this question and we're going to move on, but I did want to get the second part or some thoughts on the second part. It says, meaning that they go back with their children to the abuser when there are other options.
Thanks for clarifying. I would say, we know statistically that it takes folks a while to actually leave their abuser, meaning they go back and forth many times before they actually leave. And we also know statistically that the most harmful and unsafe time for a survivor is when they are trying to leave an abusive situation. And so it's just not practical to say that they're willingly exposing their children to domestic and intimate partner violence. Just because we know that, especially for Black women, we have a disproportionate high rate of homicide, especially when there's a firearm present in the home. And so it just isn't practical to say that one should just leave an abusive situation and use those other options or resources.
Again, there's an assumption that the alternative is safer. We have to think about how our children, specifically Black children, are going through the system, the foster care system, and then ending in prison or ending in other ways that are not detrimental to them. So when you're talking about safer alternatives, I don't necessarily, I think there's an assumption that engaging with CPS is a safer alternative. And as a former foster care child myself, I think that there are a lot of ways that the system could have made it harder for me, or they did make it harder for me to not feel like, to not be able to participate in my community as I am now. And I have a lot of friends who went through the system right now who I actually personally help on a regular basis, because when you turn a certain age, the system says goodbye. And they were also re-victimized in some of those homes, and whether it's foster care homes or group homes. So we have to really think about, what are these alternatives that we're talking about? Okay. Are they really safer?
And we want to look at the fact that sometimes you may find a shelter who may keep you for a week. They may keep you for 30 days. But what happens after that if you can't find anywhere to go? Homelessness and domestic violence are so, woven together. And sometimes folks go back because they need a roof over their children's head. It's like that big question, why did she stay or why doesn't she leave? There's so many factors. And it's not that she wants to be in that relationship, but, and so we may logically look at it and say the children are safer outside of this relationship, but that's not what she's seeing when she has to feed them. She has to house them. She has to clothe them. And not that it's a great opportunity, but if this shelter, let's say it's 30 days, where the abuser dwells. So sometimes there's not a choice for her.
Thanks, folks. We're gonna move on. What would trauma-informed policing look like? What would the impact be for Black women who have experienced multiple forms of trauma and victimization?
Is it an oxymoron to say trauma-informed police response? I don't want to imagine what that would look like, because I don't think they're the best people to respond to these things. Point blank. They don't need to be funded for those situations.
Okay.
Well, you know what? I think since they are there anyway, they should be trained. I think that trauma-informed policing would look like a victim may, or, could possibly have a favorable experience. Police would then maybe, not that it will happen, but training, we can't say the training may not work because the reality is that they're there anyway, right? When you call 911, they're coming. And so maybe police can be trained at the very nature of trauma. What does trauma look like? Instead of, and then they can better assess who the aggressor is, right? So you know what trauma looks like, the physical signs, or someone is shaking, or they're not answering you and cannot remember what just happened, and all of those signs of traumas. Maybe if they were trained in what trauma looks like, it's less likely that these victims would be re-traumatized right then, and maybe they would mind asking for help if they feel safe in that environment. Trauma-informed care, it's a long shot when it comes to police, but what if they could be trained, right, to understand what trauma is? And then you meet this person and that more likely than not that they have had trauma in their lives, and this trauma is impacting their decisions. So I think I think police should be trained in trauma-informed care.
Yeah, and I think this shows really how we're not a monolith, right?
Well, I was just about to say, I was literally just about to say, I'm really glad that we have some different perspectives on how to solve these problems.
I was gonna share an alternative, which is the crisis assistance help out on the streets, CAHOOTS, which is like a mobile mental health crisis intervention. So when I say I'm giving up on the police, it's because I know that we spend so much money, so many dollars training them. 20 years ago, working at the Rape Crisis Center, you know, I used to train police officers, and oh my goodness, yes, they did receive the trainings, and it was not an easy training to go through every year, but we did it. I think it's time for us to think about to imagine other options. And there's some options that have been working. Instead of calling the police, or instead of relying on the police, like the Cahoots program in Oregon. I mean, that's Oregon, but there are other few programs that train other responders, first responders, that are not necessarily police.
I was just going to lift up the domestic abuse response team program that's in use here in the city of Los Angeles, and as a potential alternative when we talk about trauma-informed policing. And, you know, DART has a really interesting history, because really it's a grassroots movement that was started by community members who recognized that when police are responding to 911 calls for DV, they're not trained. They're not trauma informed. They don't know how to recognize trauma, much less how to interact in a trauma informed way with survivors. And so what if we pair them with DV advocates from the community and from community-based organizations to respond together to the scene of DV calls? And the advocate is providing that immediate on-scene crisis intervention in a trauma-informed, culturally responsive way. And everything that's communicated to the advocate is confidential, cannot be shared with the police unless the victim specifically authorizes that disclosure. What if we tried that? And so they did. And so, you know, since 1996, you know, the DART program has been in practice, and it's now been expanded to all 21 divisions. Is it a perfect solution? No, but I think it's one that we, you know, should take a closer look at. Right now, you know, DART is only on duty 40 hours a week, but we know DV is happening 24/7. We should have DART teams available around the clock to respond together to these crisis calls. And, you know, the beauty of DART is that it's a community-based concept, right? So you have accountability, you have transparency, and you have, you know, community engagement, you know, people who care about the community and who want to ensure that the police response is one that is helpful and not harmful. And so I think there are ways, if we want to look at working within what exists, to do it in a more trauma-informed way.
And Allison, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about DART when I'm saying I think that is part of their training. I think they're learning. I think these DART officers and advocates are teaching them what trauma informed is. So that was one of my thoughts with DART as well. Allison does an amazing job with this DART program. So I think that's a training.
Thank you for all of your different perspectives, and thank you for lifting up some organizations and practices that sound like they're community-based are actually working, just so folks can have some alternatives to kind of work with and give a different perspective and open mind of some options, some other options. In what ways can the voices of Black leadership in mainstream programs be elevated? From an advocate perspective, which elements of police reform policy should be elevated to center the concerns and protection of Black women? Okay, we can transition into something else. No worries. You all have actually answered what my next question was be. I was going to ask you all about some of those model policies that have been drafted. If there are others that you would like to uplift, I certainly am open to that. If not, we will transition into organizations. What organizations are leading in identifying best practices? Who are the thought leaders, organizers, public intellectuals, policymakers, as well as think tanks that you think are folks that are leading in identifying best practices?
Can I ask a question of clarification?
You certainly can.
When you say best practices in what regard? In terms of police reform, in terms of
Police reform, best practices in being thoughtful about the way in which they're protecting the public, and in particular, Black women, think tanks in the way of putting out good information to say what has worked, what hasn't worked, what has been helpful, different organizations that lend itself to trauma-informed practices generally. Who are those folks? You know, where do they work? Are there policymakers or politicians that are leading the charge and raising their hand saying, these are the kinds of folks and these are the policies that I want to support and that I want voted on. Public intellectuals, folks that are getting out there educating folks and telling them, hey, this is the way that we should be doing things. You know, this is how we can have a less carceral practices and lend itself more to accountability and the like. Even organizers. Who are these people? Who are these people that our audience should be following, should be reading, and should be writing to?
I think Mariam Kaba is probably one of the best for me in terms of abolition and domestic violence and sexual violence. I would say Love and Accountability by Aisha Simmons is also great. She is a lot of people already know this, but she's the one who directed No, the Rape documentary. I think she's one of the first people that started talking about accountability in a way that made so much sense to me as a survivor of sexual violence. And so those two folks are the first ones that come to mind for me.
Thanks so much. Anyone else? Folks that are engaging the community in this kind of work, or different programs, different things that you're doing within your own programs?
As a federal policy person, of course, I'm going to name a policy maker. But federally, she can do no wrong in my eyes, which is not true. But I think Representative Ayanna Pressley is a really good example of a federal legislator who uses her own experience as a survivor and who tries to engage the community when it comes to creating policies that impact survivors. And so that's just one. I think Rep. Cori Bush also does a good job of that as well, but definitely Ayanna Pressley with a lot of her different resolutions and bills that she has sponsored and co-sponsored throughout the 117th Congress. I think she's a really good example of a policymaker that tries to actively listen to community members and organizations and survivors and other stakeholders and create policies that are informed and shaped by the people who are most impacted versus what we see a lot of the time, which is policymakers who just create things out of thin air.
Thank you.
I would lift up here in California the work of the California Black Women's Collective, which is really looking at how we harness the power of Black women to affect policy change, to vote into office those officials who are going to implement policies that favorably impact our communities, whether it's with regard to police reform or domestic violence intervention as it pertains to Black women. We're so good at getting people out, to vote. And to vote in a particular way and to vote a particular, person into office. But what they're really starting to look at is the issue of intimate partner violence as it pertains to Black women. And how can they as a collective use their power to ensure that those that they are putting their weight behind are actually centering the voices of Black women survivors. So I would lift up their work. And I think here at Genesis Center, I think as we have grown and evolved as an organization, we're really beginning to understand the importance of policy because we can do things, individually in our silos, but how do we move beyond that and start to take what we know is working, at a very grassroots level and expand that and make it something that is considered a best practice across the board, and policy is one way that we can do that. And so we've been more intentional about putting ourselves in spaces where, we can have a say and can influence those policies that are positive and have a positive impact on our communities and on Black women.
Thanks so much. Sharman?
You're muted.
You're muted.
She said, keep going, I think.
Oh, okay. My apologies.
Oh, no, but you can keep going.
Okay. Well, folks, I just want to make sure that there aren't any questions from our participants. I know we answered a good bit of them in real time. I didn't want to wait. I wanted to go ahead and answer them on the spot as these topics began to get pretty exciting. And it doesn't look like we do. I would like to thank you all. We really appreciate your participation and all of the information that you shared. Feel free to, I'm going to give you all just some final thoughts before we wrap up. We can start with Lucane.
I was reading the comments. Thank you so much for creating this space, this community, and I hope we'll have more conversations. I think we are, at the crossroads, and we can call on a lot of people, a lot of our spirit worlds, whatever your tradition is, to help us co-create and reimagine justice and focus on accountability.
And folks, just to share, we are going to get last words from the other panelists. I just want to make sure that folks are dropping their contact information, just in case folks want to follow up with you regarding your organizations or reach out to you going forward. Monica, if you can jump in next.
Sure. Thank you so much again for creating this space. I'm honored to be on this panel with such amazing folks. And as a survivor, as someone who has experienced domestic and intimate partner violence, I believe it is my life's calling to leave the world better than I found it. And I really hope that we can move forward, continue having these important conversations, and most importantly, elevate the voices of people who are most impacted, and that is especially Black women.
Thanks so much, Monica. Allison?
Thank you, Megan, and to Ujima for coordinating this panel. It's been certainly an honor and a privilege to share space with such amazing, learned women, and I appreciate all those in the listening audience for your insightful questions and comments. And I would just say I want us to continue the conversation. There's much to discuss as we are at such a pivotal point in history as a community. And my concern is that we continue to center the voices of Black women. You know, historically, I think we as Black women have often elevated the needs of the community over our needs as women, and as Black women in particular. And I think we have an opportunity to not do that this time, that everyone's needs can be centered and accommodated as we seek to make such important and needed reforms, whether it's police reform, criminal justice reform, or racial equity reform. So let's keep it going, and let's make sure that everyone who should be at the table is at the table.
Thanks so much. And wrap us up, Sharman.
Okay, and I too am so grateful to be here, and I thank all of you. And I say that this platform, what you are doing, is so amazing, because during COVID, we saw what happens when no one is watching, right? With DV, we saw what it looks like when folks are closed off and no one is watching. So this platform that you have presented is how we keep things going, is how we let the world see and know what's going on. So I appreciate this so much. And it was such an honor to be here to share this space with so many wonderful and amazing people. So thank you.
Folks, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation. I have thoroughly enjoyed it and learned so much from our wonderful panelists. Please follow Ujima and participate in our other presentations, we have a lot going on for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, as well as please follow these folks and their organizations, as I'm sure that they are going to have very exciting things going on in the up and coming future. You can reach us at ujimacommunity.org and IG, Twitter, all of the above. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.